Welcome, everybody. My name is Brian Burns. I teach English here at Moore Park College, and I also do a few other jobs, primarily what is called Professional Development Coordinator, which involves teacher training and continuing development for our other staff members on the campus. So I'm really interested in a lot of different ideas about learning, about helping our students to grow and to succeed. And so our One Campus, One Book text this semester is this book called What the Best College Students Do by a guy named Ken Bain. And there's a whole chapter in that book that's all about embracing failure. And I thought that was really interesting, and there's a lot of ideas that I pulled from that chapter. And I thought it would be worth having a conversation about failure and ways of thinking about failure. So I wanted to foreground that there might be some technological failures as we go along. So this is entirely intentional. Prepare to fail. Take a look at this guy here. Okay. As I mentioned, technological failures from time to time. There's this guy at work. I want to point out this guy makes it. Like, if you can't see it, he's running, right? He's okay. Well, in terms, he didn't die, at least. I don't know about his career. One more. Oops. So let's go ahead and talk about the agenda, though. So I showed some examples of some silly failures, and there's a certain degree of a therapeutic nature of taking a look at somebody else's failures. But I think it's more important for us to think of our own failures from a critical thinking point of view as ways of thinking about failure, ways of approaching failure. So let's talk about what we're talking about today. So we're going to talk about how we define failure, approaches to failing, how do we do it from our own point of view, and ultimately thinking about ways that we can celebrate failure, and as it says in the poster, there are cookies. This is an important coping strategy. We'll talk about that when we get to it, though. So let's talk about, though, how we're defining failure itself. Okay. Will you guys tell me, before I put up what my thoughts are, if I start talking about failure, right, what comes to mind? What are you thinking? What are you feeling? Yeah? Okay, so you're thinking about failure in terms of class outcomes, right? So did you study enough or something like that? Okay. Yes, sir. I can see you, Jim. Not living up to your own expectations, your own image of yourself, maybe. Jeremy, yeah. Sure, and Ken Bain does talk about it in his text as well. And so if you didn't hear, Jeremy was saying he feels this kind of physiological response, that galvanic skin response where you start feeling like your skin's getting hot, you're starting to sweat, you're starting to feel like this. And there is a biological component to it, that you're in this physical defensive mode, even though we don't really live in a world where it's very likely that saber-tooth tigers will come at you. But you are still built for that, right? So Jeremy's thinking about the physiological response. You got a hand? Yes. Things didn't go as planned. Okay. And so all these are worth thinking about, and these are valuable to think about it and to foreground. Nobody likes to fail. It's not enjoyable, and that's perfectly okay to acknowledge. Failure isn't fun. Okay, so failure is what? It's frightening, yes? When we have that moment of self-image, am I as good as I thought I was? All those kinds of things. Are other people going to notice that time that I ran the forklift and destroyed the entire warehouse? It's frustrating. We tried so hard and didn't accomplish what we were hoping to accomplish. And it's discouraging. It can be very discouraging to attempt to do something, to not succeed, and just to get really down on ourselves and maybe just want to give up, right? And go have some cookies. Not yet. Okay. We can also think of failure as something else, though. And this is going to be the theme of the talk today. Failure is a lot about how you approach it and how you think about it. I can't erase the sting of failure. I can't make it go away. And I think it's authentic and honest to say that felt bad. And there's a reason why it felt bad. Yeah. Because it didn't, you didn't get what you wanted. But we can think of it in another way, as an opportunity. Different ways to think about it from opportunity, but recognizing, and someone asked the question, I asked myself, did I study enough? Did I do the right things? Did I do the right approach? The real trick in that moment, though, is not to get down on yourself, oh, I did a bad thing. No, it's the right question. Did I study enough? And the answer was no, I didn't. Okay, what are you going to do different next time? Because if you do the exact same thing again, you're going to have the exact same result. If you want a different result, you're going to try something different. Okay? Okay. A realization, new approaches, new ideas. Do I need to learn more? Do I need to grow more? We'll talk a little bit about growth mindset in just a little bit. Failure can be a teacher, if we let it. And as Yoda reminds us, right? Best teacher, if we let it. If we let failure beat us down as a submission and we just give up, well, now it's not a very good failure. Or sorry, well, it wasn't a good failure either, but it wasn't a good teacher. So it's all about you and how do you approach and think about your failure. So let me give you an exercise here. So 2 questions, and I'll give you a moment just to kind of think it over, and then I'm going to ask you kind of what you think. So I'm going to show you an equation just a moment, a physics equation, and I'm going to ask you, what does it mean? So this is a very famous equation. You should recognize this. So what does it mean, and how does it apply to your life on a day-to-day basis? This seems like I'm going completely far afield, but I'll pull it back to failure in just a moment. Trust me on this one. So here we are. E equals mc squared. Very famous equation, right? When anybody wants to sound smart in a movie or TV show, they whip out this equation. All right. Take a moment and think about it, though. What does it actually mean? Maybe it will help if I expand it, because remember that this is the end result of a very long equation. This is the end of an equation. Maybe I can show you a more complete version. It might help you. If the clicker, there we go. Okay, so now it's easier, right? Honestly, does anybody have a guess? Or does anybody know? Maybe from other classes, you've talked about this, about E equals mc squared. Yes, sir?
I know it's, I'm trying to remember, I forget what the C is, but it's energy equals mass. So I know the idea is that you're getting is how much.
It has to do with energy, you're right,
Okay,
and conversions between energy and mass. Okay. Jeremy, yeah?
Am I remembering that
The
right?
C is speed of light,
Yeah.
right? Okay, so the C is speed of light. So, I mean, it's not, this isn't a physics. As I said, I teach English, right? I don't teach physics, right? So forgive me if I get the physics a little wrong on this, especially anybody who's watching this maybe on their own time who actually is a physics major. I apologize if I get it wrong. But E equals mc squared, so energy equals mass times the speed of light squared. Okay, so what does that actually mean, though, on a day-to-day basis for us? Now, first off, I'm going to point out, some of you, did a great job of taking that attempt to use your prior knowledge to work your way through this equation. But a lot of you didn't know the answer. But none of you raised your hand and said, I don't know. Why not? Now you're learning.
I knew what it was. It's just that I wasn't too sure. Like, it could be wrong.
Oh.
But I definitely knew what it was.
So you were afraid of failing.
Exactly.
You were afraid of publicly saying something that was incorrect.
Yeah.
Okay. And what do you think would happen if you had said something that was incorrect?
Embarrassment, pretty much.
Embarrassment for
Failure,
you?
Yeah.
Okay. But do you think any of us would come at you? Or are we going to,
No.
slash your tires or shave your cat or something like
No.
that? I mean, probably not.
Yeah.
So that's a valid point, though, to point out that we have this fear and we have this trepidation about being called out by others, right? Because we're social animals, we want people to think well of us. But especially from a learning point of view, it is super important to get comfortable with that particular phrase, I don't know. Use it in class. Use it with your discussion with your classmates and your professor. Because if I don't know what you don't know, I can't help you find out. And I don't know what you don't know. Now, you know what you don't know, but I don't know that you don't know. Something like that. It's not, well, and that's a question. From the application, so I'll kind of jump through the next step. There's lots of applications in a practical sense for E equals mc squared. I'm not going to have time to get into that right now, and again, not a physics class. But it really has a lot to do with relativity. It has to do with the way that light moves, or things move at the speed of light, like other bits of the electromagnetic spectrum, including electricity. It has a lot to do with communication between satellites, for example. Because satellites, there's some lag time between the way they communicate with each other, fractions of a a second, but it adds up and it makes a difference. And so one of the really important applications of E equals mc squared for our daily lives is how much do you guys use your GPSs on your phone, for example? And that's just one kind of satellite communication. There's lots of ways that we use satellites. But in the days before our GPS, where it was so easy and so convenient, you can use it now just to walk around. Like I was in London over the summer with my wife, and we used my GPS just to walk around the city, right? So before GPS, we would have had to use paper maps that I'm trying to pull up. Oh, here we are. I don't know if you guys ever use these Thomas guides. These are specific to California. And they're pretty fun, I'll be honest, but I remember the days before GPS when I was working as a wedding photographer. So I went to lots of people's houses all over the place around here and whip out the Thomas guide and you work your way through. And it's kind of fun in a way. It's kind of a detective thing, but oh man, is it time consuming, right? So, but that's really not the point. And so, yeah, and obviously this comes from Albert Einstein. Now you might think, because very famously, people talk about Einstein as a failure. And that's not really the case. I want to kind of take this opportunity to dispel that. That's what we call an apocryphal story. That when he was a child, he failed math class or something like this. This is not true. He did fine in math. What he did fail at was that after he got his degree in mathematics, he applied to teach math at a very prestigious university, and he couldn't get that teaching position. And so he wound up working as a file clerk instead because he got to pay the bills. Right? So that's what he failed at, right? Being initially, eventually, obviously, he became a very successful teacher and practitioner of theoretical physics and things like that. But really the question for us, though, right now, not so much about Einstein, not so much about relativity. If you didn't already know that, does that make you a failure? If you don't know everything, can you know everything? I mean, maybe, I don't know, you can try. And I think it's worth trying. I think it's worth trying to fill your brain with everything. But right now, of course, you can't know everything, and that doesn't make you a failure. And that's the way of thinking about it. So when we fail, right, the question is, excuse me, do this, okay. It's an opportunity to realize a gap in our knowledge. So right now, we recognize, you know what, I don't know much about physics as I think I did. I don't know enough about, as much about Einstein as I thought I did. I didn't know enough about, or as much as I thought about GPS devices, that kind of stuff. So you have a realization to recognize a gap in your knowledge. And that's worthwhile. There's nothing wrong with, like I said a moment ago, it's nothing wrong with admitting, I don't know. Nobody knows everything. It's literally impossible. How many words in the English language do you think? There's some debate about this, by the way, but about 1 million, give or take. It depends on who you talk to. It also depends, do we count conjugated verbs as separate words or as the same word? But about 1 million, give or take. The average college graduate will know about 250,000 of them, and will use quite a bit fewer than that in their daily lives. I probably know a bit more than that because words are sort of my thing, but there's a lot of words that I don't know. Does that make me a failure as a college professor that I don't know all 1 million English words? I don't know, depends on how you look at it. I don't think so, though. Okay, so recognize a gap in your knowledge, and a gap in knowledge means it's an opportunity to learn something to fill that gap. So I recognize I don't know all the words. So from time to time, I encounter words I've never seen before, and it's even in class sometimes. Students will bring up a word, especially very specialized language from their major or their just curious backgrounds, and they'll say something, and I'll literally say to the student, I don't know what that means. Can you tell me what that means, please? And that's an opportunity for me to learn. I don't have to be right all the time. I don't have to know everything. I don't even try to pretend like I know everything. So, a chance to grow in your personal knowledge. I know a lot more words than I used to because when I encounter words that I don't know, I take the time to think about them, unpack them, imagine how I'm going to use them from now on. And a lot of times from my students, actually. So, I want us to think about this concept of failing as a verb, as opposed to being a failure. Being is also a verb, but we're using like a noun, so it's a gerund. You know what word? But okay, so failing versus being a failure. This is a really important mindset. Now, I don't want to say stole, but I stole this graphic from someone else. But this is really important to kind of unpack these ideas that basically, when we fail as a verb, that doesn't necessarily define us as human beings if we choose to think of it in those terms. I did something, I failed at something. That doesn't make you yourself a failure. And that's the important thing. We can fail at tasks all the time. We can fail at goals all the time. That doesn't define you as a human being. But you could choose to let it if you wanted to, or if you're not thinking carefully and critically about it. Okay? So if you decide to define yourself as, I am a failure because I wasn't able to do this and I wasn't able to do that, then you're putting yourself in a negative position. It's much harder to grow and to learn from there if you're giving up. That's really the important thing. So remember, when we fail, that you failed that task. You didn't fail as a human being. Okay. Failing with the clicker. So, approaches to failure. So I'm saying all these things in very nebulous kinds of ways, but here's some ways in a more practical sense to think about failure. Think about it as a learning opportunity, and to think about what kind of failure. There's lots of ways to talk about different kinds of failures. In this talk, I'm going to talk about 3 specific kinds of failures, but there's other kinds as well. One is just extrinsic failures, right? Failures that are from the outside. The other one is a skill or a knowledge failure. Did you fail just because you didn't have enough knowledge or enough skill to accomplish the task? Or expectation failure. We'll talk about the concept in just a moment. That's from the Ken Bain book in particular that really got me interested in this. So it is important to remember this mindset, which I mentioned a little while ago. There's lots of ways to talk about mindset. But in particular, there's what we call a fixed mindset, where you define yourself as I am. Okay, as a singular, as a completed entity. You are not a completed entity. You are always growing and learning. Your body is expanding. It might be done getting taller, right? But your body is always adding mass or removing mass. Your entire body will replace its entire cellular structure every 7 years. So you are always growing and becoming. And that's a really important part, as opposed to the growth mindset, where we recognize that we are growing, we are becoming. And so if we get out in front of that, we make those conscious, critical thinking decisions. I am growing. So how do I choose to grow? How do I choose to use these opportunities to make myself improve? So as an example here. So we have these 2 superheroes, Superman and Batman. Now, as a nerd, my secret, but as a nerd, I actually prefer Superman as a character. But for this example, though, I think it's helpful for us to think about it in this kind of analogy where Superman just is Superman, right? How does Superman get his powers? I mean, he was just born with them, right? I'm not sure he was an alien in the yellow sun and blah, blah, blah. But Superman just is Superman. In fact, Superman has to try hard to not be Superman, right? He has to pretend to be someone else when he's not Superman. So Superman is the fixed mindset. He is always Superman. And in fact, that's why it's so difficult to write stories about Superman, and so many stories about Superman are about him losing his powers, right? Because as a fixed entity, he's completed, he's done. And it's not really that interesting, right? Whereas Batman has to become Batman. Batman has to put effort into becoming Batman, okay? So Batman started with an advantage of being super rich, right? Kind of makes it better, but, from the Lego movie. But even so, Batman has to put on that persona of Batman and to learn and to grow. And so that's more of the growth mindset. As opposed to just being, it's really the question of becoming. All right. Mindset. All right. So let's talk about this concept of your expectations of yourself, your expectations of the world. Let's put things into perspective. Because when we fail, it can feel like the end of the world. It can feel like the whole world is against me. The whole universe has come against me, right? That I'm trodden upon. But I think it's important to, real briefly, remind ourselves the scale that we're talking about when it comes to reality itself. You guys know what this is? What's that? Well, it's a slice of the observable universe, right? So this is a pretty famous image, actually. Basically what happened, they stuck one of the orbital telescopes in what they thought was a dead spot in the night sky. And they left it there for about a month and said, okay, what can we see? So what you're seeing here are not stars. These are all galaxies. Okay, so the Milky Way, just for perspective here, so according to this one side I'm looking at, science.com, there's about 250 to 400 billion stars within just our galaxy. That's a big range, by the way, 250 to 400 billion. That's just in our galaxy, right? And how many galaxies, again from science.com, no one's quite sure. They think at least 100 billion, maybe as many as 200 billion. So I know someone else was saying, no, there's at least 2 trillion. Okay, so that's on the macro, the macro scale, the large scale. So where are you in that great scale of the universe? That little failure you had to turn your car on or to change your tire, in the grand scale of things, was that really that big of a deal? Worth thinking about. And the other side of it, just real briefly here. So I was going to go to the other side, the microscopic, right? So here we have at the molecular level, and even down below the molecular level, we have the atomic and the subatomic, and things that are so small for us to even understand how small they are. I was looking at some numbers on this one. An atom. So already an atom is a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of a molecule. But an atom itself, I was looking this up, so they're saying that the nucleus of an atom, so that's the protons and the neutrons that form the nucleus of the atom, is 1/100,000th of the size of the entire atom. So we're moving into the atom at 100,000 times. And then to make up a proton are subatomic particles they called quarks. Quarks are something like 2,000 times smaller than the proton. So how many of these do you think inhabit the universe? Beyond counting, obviously. So when I talk about the scale of yourself and your place in the universe, remember to keep things in perspective. Remember to keep things where we are. There we are. Somewhere in between this impossible number of stars and this impossible number of subatomic particles, we have instead these moments of beauty and these moments of joy and these moments of fun. And I think those are the things to spend a little extra time thinking about and focusing on. So some other approaches to failure. As we said, what type of failure are we talking about? An extrinsic failure. There we are. Failure due to forces that you have no control over. Okay, these are just things that are going to happen that nothing's going to stop it from happening. All right, so it could be some jerk knocking you over, right? You have no control over that. It could be natural forces, right? It could be a natural disaster like this. All right, so, or it could be again, other people making mistakes that still have an impact on you. Okay, you can't stop yourself running into this guy. There's nothing you could do. Okay, so these are what we call extrinsic failures, and it's important to remember to think about, if you have a moment of failure, to take that moment of reflection, could I have done something different here? Or was this just going to happen? And that's the critical thinking question to ask yourself. And sometimes, I mean, yeah, this young lady here who's getting hit by the wave, probably it wasn't just a good plan to set yourself up on that rock. But I don't know, maybe not. It's hard to say. Maybe they already got some really good pictures anyway. I mean, this is hilarious. I hope that she maintains this video on her own personal file here. But could you have left extra space behind this car here? I mean, maybe. There are some small opportunities for learning here, but mostly these are outside forces that you never really had much control over anyway. So it's really not I mean, certainly it's worth acknowledging. I'm unhappy about what happened, but try not to take it too personally. So when we're talking about, okay, so how are we dealing with extrinsic failure? Okay. First, we need to acknowledge some realities, some truths. We can't always control the circumstances in our lives. We don't, as much as we'd like to control. Yes, sir?
For failure.
Okay, so the
All the
question
time.
was, do you think we should set ourselves up for failure? I don't think that's necessarily a good plan from a intentional point of view. To say, now, to give yourself a big challenge and to say, I'm going to do this even though there's a good chance I'm going to fail, that's worthwhile. That's taking a risk. That's pushing yourself, pushing your boundaries. That's not setting yourself up for failure, though. So I guess it depends on how you define that concept. If you know for sure that you're going to fail at a task, I don't necessarily know if that was a good use of time. But, so for example, I know I couldn't, for example, do 50 pull-ups right now. Right? I could do maybe 5. Okay, so if I'm really setting up my goal, 50 push-ups, and I get mad at, or 50 pull-ups, and I get mad at myself that I can't do it, well, I already knew I couldn't do it. And the only result of that is just me being angry, knowing I need to work harder to get stronger. But I kind of already knew that. But if I know that I can do 5, okay, well, what if I push that? Let's make it 6 or 7. And that, I might not be able to make 6 or 7. And so in a sense, there's a chance of failure there, but not necessarily a guaranteed shot. Does that make sense? So setting high goals for yourself and having a good chance of failure, that's worthwhile as long as you know going into it there's a good chance to fail, and you're keeping that open mind for what is the learning opportunity in this experience. That's a very good question. Thank you. Remember that you can't always control your emotional reactions. So you can't control the things around you. And I just said a moment ago, it's all about mindset and the way you think about it and blah, blah, blah. But the thing is, of course, we're not rational computers, right? We are human beings. We're going to have emotional responses, and that's okay. It's okay to get mad at yourself. It's okay to get mad at whatever happened. It's okay to scream and whatever. I hope you don't do anything destructive. Please don't punch any walls or anything like this. But it's okay to have that moment of anger, and don't get angry at yourself for being angry, right? Whatever emotions you feel are always valid. The real question is, what do you do with that afterwards? Sometimes just feel it. Just work your way through it. And that's all we can do for a little while. And then we can have that moment of reflection. Because you can always choose how to act. You can't choose how you feel necessarily. That's hard. That takes a lot of training. But you can choose how you act, right? And you can choose to reflect and learn from this moment, right? That you can have control over after you've had that emotional outburst. All right. So here's this cat. He's going to fail. But look at this cat. He's going. He's going. See? Sometimes you just got to push through, right? Didn't go exactly the way I wanted, but I still got where I wanted to be. Right? So that's another way of thinking about failure. Sometimes you just got to bear down and work your way through it. This one's a little quicker. So failure due to lack of knowledge or insufficient skill level. Again, define yourself more by the things that you're doing or not doing, not what you are or not. So, for example, a couple summers ago, my engine, which looks like pretty much like this one, this isn't my actual engine in my car, but it's pretty much the same one, needed a new alternator. The alternator itself isn't that expensive. It's about $500 for an alternator, okay? It's about $2,000 though to get somebody to put it in your car. I don't have $2,000 laying around. And then I had friends of mine, car guys, right, who would say, oh, it's super easy to fix an alternator. You could do it yourself. Just look it up online. Okay. It'll take you like 2 hours, no problem. So 3 days later, I had my car taken apart. I had to take off one wheel. I have it up on a jack. It's just a mess, right? And I'm a mess, and and my car has been called every possible curse word you could imagine, including other languages, right? So I'm having failure to accomplish my goal, but that doesn't mean I'm a failure. It doesn't make me a stupid person. So friends of mine who are very experienced with cars say this is an easy procedure, but I'm not experienced with cars. Okay, so this is my moment to sit and reflect on what's going on. Yeah, I didn't accomplish my goal in the time frame I set for myself, but I do have this moment to think about, yeah, but what am I doing as I'm taking my car apart? I'm learning about how it's put together, about how it works, about, not just that part itself, but the car itself. Anybody know where the alternator is, by the way? Where's the alternator? Yeah? This one right here. So, yeah, I didn't know that. All right, so that's the alternator. Now, this is deceptive, because look, it's right up front, right? It's easy to get off. Anyway, so because there's belts and stuff underneath it, it got really complicated. Anyway, so this is, again, an opportunity to say, oh, I just suck at cars and just walk away and never try again. Or to fight my way through it, learn from the experience, and then when something else might happen to my car, now I know a little bit more about my engine. But the most important thing I've learned is that I can do it. Right? I don't have to just say, I'm just bad at cars. This has a lot to do with us as students. And as, even though I'm not an actual student anymore, I'm still learning and growing. I was given a disservice when I was a young person, when I was in school. I don't remember who specifically told me this, but I've heard it from more than one source. More than one teacher said, you know what? You're just bad at math. You just don't have a math brain. But you're good at language. So just focus on that. Don't worry about the math. Am I just a bad math person? I just have a bad math brain? No. Okay? I had problems with math because I didn't like it. It was boring. I just wasn't very good at it, so I didn't try harder at it. Could I have gotten better? Absolutely. But that's sort of the way of thinking about it from that mindset. Okay? And one way to think about it, when it comes to skill and knowledge failure, it's fair to acknowledge that you're not good at this or that kind of thing, but I think it's really important to add one extra word to that phrase. I'm not good at X, right? First off, talk about it as the skill, not yourself. I am. No, throw that out there. Talk about the skill itself. I'm not good at auto repair, but add one extra word to that sentence. Yet. Yeah? I'm not good at auto repair yet. I'm not good at math yet. I'm not good at writing yet. Whatever skill we're talking about, it doesn't define you as a human being, because you can always learn and grow. All right. So we talked about, this sort of mindset, opportunities to learn and grow. We talked about the growth mindset. So look at Jackie Chan here. So he's going to get hit in the face, whack. So Jackie Chan could just say, I just am a guy who gets hit in the face. I just am bad at stunt work. I just am bad at martial arts. I should just give up, right? Did Jackie Chan just give up in his stunt work? You guys know Jackie Chan? You know this movie? No. But instead, Jackie Chan says no. He acknowledges when there's a moment of failure. There's a moment where, and all of his movies have this, by the way. At the end of his movies, he very intentionally includes these bloopers where he hurts himself, where he gets hurt, doing these things to show that it's a process. He has to work very hard at doing what he does. He does also for safety purposes, too, so that kids would watch the movie and recognize that there's a real serious danger to try to recreate these stunts. He actually has a really interesting autobiography out of it. I recommend you guys reading it if you get a chance. But see, so Jackie Chan works, and he practices, and he rehearses, and he keeps on going, and he becomes this very successful performer, this very successful athlete, this very successful person, just kind of overall, right? So that's kind of this idea, also thinking about it in terms of our role models and who can we look up to. And anybody can fail. That's okay. There's nothing wrong with failing. The question is, what do you do with that failure? Okay. And then expectation failure. And this is, I'll pull up Ken Baines too. But, So when we approach the world with a certain set of expectations, I expect things to run this way, I expect things to run that way. And then we get in that moment and it doesn't work out that way. I give you an example of this. When I went to college, so I didn't really have to struggle that hard with language in high school. It was easy. I learned the formula. I was able to earn easy A's in English. In my AP English in my senior year, I had an English teacher who knew that test inside and out, and she knew exactly the strategies to get the AP test. So I got a high score you can get on the AP test without even trying, right? Because I'd been coached very well. So I got to college, right? Oh, by the way, when you get the high score on the AP, it means I get to skip freshman composition. I don't even take that. I'm an upper division. I got a 400 level English class my very first semester in college. I'm good at math. I'm not good at math, sorry. I'm good at writing. I'm good at English. This is my expectation. So I turn in that first paper. I do everything like I'd done before. How'd I do? Not very well. Not a fail, but it was a D+. Okay, so it's not exactly a failure, but it's pretty much a failure, especially for me that I was super dependent on my financial aid and things like that to get very good grades. So that was an expectation failure on my part. Another example I can give, anybody in the classroom who's a parent knows exactly what I mean. Children are your expectation failure, right? You think you have your life put together, you think you have it all figured out, and it's very easy to watch other people with their children and say, oh, I'm not going to be a parent like that. I'm not going to make that mistake. But once a kid shows up, right? Most of you are fairly young, so you might choose to have kids later on, but just keep that in the back mind, right? Okay, so here's examples of expectation failure. So here's this lady. So she's expecting the floor to work a certain way, but she's not recognizing she's looking at herself in a mirror, right? So the floor is curved in the opposite direction than she's expecting, right? So this failure of expectation. Yes, sir. I'll wait for the mic here. Yes.
I have a friend who's sort of sets very, very high expectations, like they're a bit of a perfectionist, but in that sort of thinking about I have to do everything this way, they often will put off work, and it seems like this sort of self-fulfilling prophecy, especially with classwork, where they get very close to the deadline because they're like just turning it over in their head over and over. What would you say what advice would you give them?
So that's a very good question, this idea of perfectionism, and to the point where we get so paralyzed because we want to have that mental image of ourselves as someone who is perfect. And now you're faced with a task that's going to force you to acknowledge that you're not perfect. And that's really a serious challenge for a lot of us to have to go through. How would I approach that? Well, my daughter, my oldest daughter, has that exact same experience where she just wants to get it right the first time, every time. She's had that since kindergarten. And I don't know where she gets it from because I'm not telling her this. But we do have these very high expectations for ourselves, and that's okay to have high expectations. The real point is to recognize that failure is part of learning. And that's the growth mindset part. I wouldn't know how to talk to your specific friend because I would have to know that person and sit down and have a conversation about it. But to answer that kind of concern about perfectionism, though, is yes, to acknowledge that failure is part of learning, and that that's where real learning is taking place. Because if you're walking in and you at the first day of class, you say, you know what, I already know how to do this. Here's the hoop, I jumped through it, there we go, give me my A. Okay, fine, you got an A, but did you learn? That's the important question. And that's what Ken Bain talks about in the textbook, that there are these superficial learners that are just trying to make it through, right? Or the strategic learners who already say, I'm so smart, and they come up with very strategic ways to maintain that intelligent self-image. And then there are the deep learners, right, in between, who recognize failure as an opportunity to learn that they're not perfect and that there's always more to learn and to grow. And part of that means failing. That person, that friend of yours, is going to have to fail at something and then have to learn from that experience. Because otherwise we hide. We hide from failure, try to maintain our own self-image. And that's an impediment to learning. So as we say before, so how to deal with expectation failure? It's an opportunity to rethink your point of view, a way to think about yourself, your own way of thinking about your experiences called metacognition, and ultimately this idea, just try to have some fun with it. The element of humor is always surprise, and so if expectation failure is something that surprises us, is there some humor in this? Is there something that we can learn and have some fun? Maybe not, by the way. Sometimes it's just bad. Try to have some fun, though. At the very least, look at funny baby videos on the internet. Okay, so we're moving through here. Okay. This is it. Every failure is a necessary step on the road to success. I've had a lot of failures in my life, and every failure I've had has led me in some way or another to where I am in my life right now. With my family, with my children, my beautiful campus I'm working here, with your beautiful students. Every failure you've had has led you to whatever positive outcomes are also part of your life. Failure is not something to be afraid of. It's something to embrace and to celebrate. So here we have Thomas Edison who tells us, I've not failed, I just found 10,000 ways that didn't work. What he meant was 10,000 ways of stealing from other people, but that's a separate conversation. But I don't have time to get into that. So yeah, celebrate your failure. So this is a movie called Meet the Robinsons, a Disney movie. And so this character here who's crying has failed in this invention. And all the other characters are celebrating. They're saying, great, you failed, fantastic. And he says, what are you talking about? How is that a good thing that I failed? He says, you get to learn. You get to grow. You get to become. Isn't that awesome? Okay, so in this case, the failure was just, people got dirty. No one got hurt. We can't always necessarily be super happy about failing. I'm not saying you should be happy, but I am saying that we have an opportunity to learn, and we should embrace that. And so with that in mind, we're kind of wrapping it up here. Let's see. Well, yes, cookies come up in just a sec. I'm going to give you, if you wish, I have some of these over here. In fact, so I have these two, may as well. There are cookies. So at the end, we'll give out some cookies. But I also have these certificates of failure, right? So this is your certificate of permission to fail. Okay, and if the text here is saying, this acknowledges that you have earned the right to fail in all manners possible, including but not limited to failing to pass any test, exam, paper, project, assignment, or course. In addition, permission is granted to fail at relationships, emails, texts, jobs, applications, and so on, and still be recognized as a valid, excellent, and worthy human being. You have permission to fail as long as you think about it in terms of what can I learn, how can I grow? And that's really what learning is all about deep learning. So I think we are close to the end. How much time do we have? 5 minutes? Okay. So we have a little bit of time for discussion and some Q&A. Any other questions, comments? Yes? Oh, wait, make the mic here.
What would you say would be like the difference in terms of responses for, like, for instance, like if I fail, sometimes I'll get angry or frustrated, but then other times I'll laugh.
Mm-hmm.
So what would you say is like the reasoning behind responses to that?
I would have to know the circumstances of what that particular failure was. But I think, as I've said a little bit earlier, whatever your emotional response is appropriate and valid. I think it's a mistake if we think of that there are negative emotions and positive emotions. No, they're just emotions. And whatever reaction you're having is that's a question for yourself, really, to unpack that. Say, why am I angry? And to really think about this, am I angry because I thought I had this image of myself as being very capable in this way, and it turned out not to be that way? Or sometimes you might find the humor of it if it was something you were trying that you already knew there was a good chance that you weren't going to make it anyway, and you could kind of find the humor in it. Right, but that's a really important critical thinking question to ask yourself. Why am I angry right now? And actually, wait until you're done being angry. Actually, there's some research indicating, basically, long story short, your critical thinking brain, your prefrontal cortex, stops working as efficiently when you're angry because the fear response, the nerve response, your amygdala are all lit up, and it actually interferes with rational thought. So in that moment of high emotion, just live that emotion as long as you're not harming anyone or yourself. But afterwards, taking that moment to reflect and to think about, why am I angry, or why do I think this is funny? That's definitely an important part of this process. Good. Questions or concerns? Yeah. Get the mic coming.
What's like the extent to which we should like bask in like the glory of failure? Because more times than not, like if you're working for someone, if you have a boss and people are relying on you and you fail, like you can like stand there and say, this is great that I failed, but at the same time, it's like you might get fired or something or get a pay cut because you did. So like, how do you manage it when like the sort of perception of failure isn't like in your hands?
Okay, that's a very good point. So you're right that we have obligations to other people, right? And so we can fail in certain tasks that have an impact on others. So I'm not saying that failure is always something that we're going to laugh and have fun with, right? It can be serious business, and it can certainly impact other people. What I would imagine, though, is that there probably wasn't one thing that would lead to you being fired if you make a mistake, right? So you make a mistake, you have that conversation with who's ever been affected by it. I've made a mistake. I failed in this way. And then have that conversation. What did we learn? How do we avoid making that mistake in the future? And so at that point, it's a serious conversation. It's still a moment to recognize that this failure was an opportunity to learn, was okay, here's the mistake I made, and discuss it with other people. I recognize the mistake I made, and here's what I'm going to do to avoid making that same mistake in the future. And obviously at that point, especially if it's really affecting people in terms of like paycheck or safety, you obviously wouldn't treat that lightheartedly. You wouldn't joke around with something like that. Certainly the guy at the beginning with the forklift who destroys the warehouse, that wasn't the first time he's made a mistake with the forklift, right? That's a guy who's been unsafe and hasn't learned from being unsafe in the way that he's been doing things for quite some time. And that was the end result of a series of failures to learn at that point. Yeah. Oh, well, I'm sorry. So we're going to have to wrap it up, but I'm certainly I'll hang out for a bit longer if you guys want to kind of have just a more one-on-one conversation here. But as I've said, so here's our certificate of failure. I'll just circulate this among the audience. Feel free to take some. Feel free to make copies. They're not copyrighted. You can make copies for friends. Maybe your perfectionist friend would like one of those. All right. So thank you very much. Thank you to all the Year Out folks who made this possible, and I will see you around campus. Thank you so much. Please have some cookies on the way out.